Hello and welcome to the Hope Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Schmalhofer, and this is episode number 62 and the podcast episode for June. The episode today is called simply 38 Years, and it is based on the passage from John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. This passage shows that there is indeed help for you in any struggle of addiction or any other struggle of life, regardless of how many years or even decades you've been in that struggle. As a little background to this passage, it speaks about a man who was an invalid for 38 years, with seemingly no hope of getting better. He and many other sick and disabled people would go to a particular pool of water. The tradition was that an angel would at times stir the water, and the first person to enter the water would be healed. This episode points out some key principles that may help you in your recovery, and also how God does indeed care for you and wants to help you. The passage of John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9 reads like this. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now, there is in Jerusalem, near the Sheep Gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once, the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. So I'd like to share 4 different principles and lessons from this passage. First, God cares for the sick and hurting. Verse 4 says, "Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed." Here in this verse, many sick and hurting people traveled here with the hope of being healed, as the tradition of the healing waters suggested. This area around the pool of water was full of sick and hurting people, people with terrible diseases and terrible afflictions. As the verse says, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. And this is where Jesus went. He could have gone another way. He could have avoided this area that was full of sick and hurting people, but he chose to go there. He had compassion on the people because he cares for everyone, even the sick and hurting. For some, he would meet their physical needs and provide healing, but he ultimately pointed everyone to the need for spiritual healing. For you today, wherever you are at in recovery from alcohol and drug addiction or any other struggle of life, remember that God cares for you and God wants to help you to be successful in recovery. God may meet your need of recovery with a dramatic healing, or he may give you the strength and courage to get the help and treatment you need. But above all, remember that God is right there with you. Just like the man in this passage, God is not avoiding you because of your struggle or your condition. God is right there with you, and he cares for you. If you look for him, you will see he is right there with you, and he cares for you, even in the midst of your most difficult struggles. And second, there is always hope with God, even after 38 years. Verse 5 says, one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" 38 years is a long time, especially to be an invalid for that time. Perhaps at this point, the man felt hopeless. Perhaps he felt trapped in his condition. Perhaps he felt he was too far gone. But then Jesus saw him and had compassion on him, and Jesus engaged with him and asked him a big question. Do you want to get well? For you today, perhaps you've been in your addiction for a long time. Perhaps you feel hopeless. Perhaps you feel trapped in your condition. Perhaps you feel you are too far gone. But just like the man in this story, God sees you and has compassion for you. And he is asking you the very same question. Do you want to get well? How do you answer this question? Do you want to get well? And also, are you willing to do whatever is necessary to get well? Are you willing to do whatever is necessary to be successful in recovery? 38 years is a long time. And regardless of how long you have been in your addiction, and regardless of how many times you have relapsed, you are not too far gone for God. Remember, there is always hope with God. And then third, everything changes with God in the picture. Verse 7 to 9 say this, "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. When I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once, the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. In this passage, everything this man had tried in the past failed. After 38 years, he was still in his crippled condition. But everything changed when Jesus was in the picture. Everything changed when God intervened in his life. Jesus gave him the command to get up, pick up your mat, and walk. And the man responded with some amount of faith to even begin to stand up. For the first time in 38 years, he began to stand up and then to walk. He was obedient to Jesus, and he was healed. He trusted God, was obedient, and picked up his mat and walked. For you today, regardless of how long you've been in your addiction, regardless of how many times you have relapsed or gone to rehab or to detox or to the hospital, everything can change with God in your life. As you trust God and are obedient to his leading in your recovery, God can indeed meet your need in a mighty way. Remember, everything can indeed change with God in your life. Life will not be perfect, but God will be there to help you. God will help you to stand and walk in the way you should go. And then fourth, God is still showing up today. I'd like to share a brief story from the Narcotics Anonymous book that relates well to this passage of John chapter 5. And this NA quote asks a very similar question as our Bible passage. This NA story is another example that God is still showing up even today. The NA quote from page 352 reads like this: "With all that I had left in me, I cried out, 'Enough!' I couldn't count the number of times I had said that. I sincerely didn't want to use any longer. Yet I reached toward the table, toward the very cause of my pain. I hadn't willed this action, yet there I was, reaching for another fix. No, my words echoed, but I was there alone. I heard a faint voice. Do you want to live or die? I sat there looking down at my seemingly endless supply of destruction. I wondered if I had finally lost my mind. Had I actually heard death's ultimatum? Had God spoken? I felt an abrupt shift. My spirit, with what must have been its last ounce of strength, dragged me battered and beaten toward life. Memories of empty promises flooded into me, of all the people I had let down and all those I had hurt. I had truly hoped it would be different this time. I stared at the clock and prayed for God to help me. Finally, at 6:30 a.m., I reached for the phone." End quote. This N.A. quote does a great job of describing the terrible struggle of addiction. His condition was also likely the result of many years of addiction, where the battle ultimately became a life or death battle. Perhaps it was God asking this man the same type of question as our Bible passage, but with different words. Do you want to live or die? Which is very much the same question from our passage of, do you want to get well? This N.A. reading says that this man prayed and asked God for help, and God showed up and gave him the courage to pick up the phone and call for help. This N.A. story and our Bible passage together give the message that even in your darkest moment, at your depths of despair, God is there and wants to help you. This man prayed to God for help, and then with God's help, he took the first step to get better. He reached for the phone and called for help. For you today, regardless of where you are at in your recovery or how many years you have been in your addiction, I encourage you to remember that God is still showing up today. God still answers prayers today, and God will answer your prayer as well. Yes, 38 years is a long time, but regardless of where you are at in your recovery, I ask you to consider this question for yourself. Do you want to get well? And are you willing to do whatever is necessary to be successful in recovery? In closing, I encourage you to remember these 4 key lessons from this passage. First, God cares for the sick and hurting, and He cares for you. Second, there is always hope with God, even after 38 years. And third, everything changes with God in the picture. Life will not be perfect, but God will be there to help you stand and walk in the way you should go. And fourth, God is still showing up today. God still answers prayers today, and He will answer your prayer as well. That is what I have for you today. Thank you for joining me on the Hope Recovery Podcast. And remember, there is always hope with God. Take care, and God bless you all. That concludes the podcast episode for today. But if I may, let me remind you, if you are interested in more faith-based recovery resources, please see the website at www.HopeRecoveryUs. And if there is any way I can help you or your recovery group or recovery ministry, please feel free to email me at HopeRecoveryUs@gmail.com, and I would be happy to talk with you further. And again, take care, and God bless you all.